So these are two images, two prints that I made for this scrapbook that I paired together that I took when I was around Success Lake around last summer. And one of them was shot on digital, one of them was shot on film. I don't know if you could tell which one is which. It's kind of obvious to me in my opinion. These images are going to be available in my print shop. I'm going to sell them as a set if you are interested. Just for anyone wondering, I thought they paired well together and I liked the images overall as a whole. But when I was printing out these images, I thought about Fujifilm's film simulations and how well they emulate film, or if it looks any different to me. In my opinion, they are different, and these are some things or qualities or aspects that I understood and kind of got accustomed with over the year. Now, these are the closest images we are going to get to a real comparison in this video. This is a non-scientific comparison, so obviously these are just qualities that I've observed and my opinions or thoughts that I had about mainly the psychology of shooting film versus Fujifilm. And yeah, that's basically the topic of today's video. I have down below linked an article I found on a more scientific in-depth comparison between Fujifilm's film simulations and real film, and that guy goes into much better detail than I could ever go through. He's got charts, he's got everything. So if you are actually looking for something that is a little more of a technical comparison, you can check that out down below as well. But for the purpose of this video, we're focused on mainly the psychology and the qualities or aspects behind shooting film versus digital emulating film sort of thing. So just a little bit of a backstory so you guys can get where I'm coming from. I initially started shooting Fujifilm because I thought it would be great to have something that has the digital conveniences of a digital camera, the convenience of shooting onto an SD card and getting it onto your computer pretty instantly while having the aesthetic and look that film has. And that's something that I found so appealing about Fujifilm cameras in general, is that you'd have kind of the best of both worlds. But then as I was editing and shooting images, and looking through the images and the quality of the images, I started thinking, if I wanted something to look like film, why don't I just shoot film instead? And so that kind of started my journey into film maybe about a year ago or so. I've shot on 35 millimeters, and then a few months ago I stepped into medium format, and I like the aesthetic of film as well, much as I do like the aesthetic of the film simulations. And now I know and kind of love both. But I like them both for different reasons, and I don't entirely think that real film can emulate Fujifilm images, just like how Fujifilm's film simulations aren't 100% in my eyes the same as film. Let me elaborate. Like I said, the images we're going to be using aren't a direct comparison because there's just too many variables in between them. Certain things like film stock, I shot this image on Portra 160 while I edited the digital image in classic chrome. So obviously the colors are going to be a bit different, and the focal length of the images are slightly different as well. I think the right image I shot on a 40 millimeter full frame equivalent, while the left one was a 50 millimeter. So close, but not particularly exact. But if anything that was very similar, it was the time of day. I shot these images within about 5 minutes of each other, so that's why they look so similar in terms of lighting and exposure. So the first point I want to make is that film, in my opinion, is more raw than digital Fujifilm images. As I've been going through and editing my Fujifilm digital images, I've noticed that sometimes the images come out and look a little bit too clean, even when I'm using film simulation recipes and whatnot. And I think this is a characteristic of digital that you can't quite get out or get rid of because you're shooting with a digital sensor, so you're able to get much finer details when it comes to shooting your subjects. And that is something that you don't quite get when you're shooting film, even in medium format. In my opinion, just looking at the images that I've shot and taken throughout the year, I've noticed that a lot of the details that come in film are a lot more blocky and everything is less finer and less detailed. And this comes from shooting on a physical format. You're literally shooting onto a film roll, so naturally there is going to be a loss of detail in your images as opposed to shooting on a digital sensor. And I have no qualms when it comes to digital versus film or anything like that. I like both. But this is just something I've observed and something I noticed, that digital images, even on an APS-C size sensor, is able to get me much finer lines. So that's something we like about film, right? Is that it has many imperfections that are just not associated with digital. I think digital comes out a little too clean, but that is something I like when I want that aesthetic. So I'll go for it if I want my images to look like that someday. And if I want that kind of more raw or organic look, I will take and pick up a film camera and shoot with that instead. Another aspect about film is that what you see is what you get. So in terms of psychology behind shooting experience and editing experience, it's quite clear and quite obvious that there's less room for editing when it comes to film. Meanwhile, when you have Fujifilm or digital images, you're able to control and kind of make use of all the dynamic range in the world. So if I shot something super underexposed, I know I can recover a good amount of that detail in post within the shadows and the highlights or whatever it happens to be. Film, there is a lot less latitude. So what you see is what you get. If you gotta kind of time the exposure for when you're shooting it there, and then in post there's not so much room for flexibility, because if you try to edit too much, your image kind of breaks apart and falls apart. There is my inherent struggle between film and digital, because I don't want to over edit my images, but I also want to make use of the ability for digital to recover a lot of that lost detail. So when I'm shooting film, it's a good thing because I can't recover any of that detail or images. So what I see is what I get. But when I shoot digital, sometimes it makes me want to take advantage of the system and the capabilities of the program and the software. And then I end up with an image that is, yes, well exposed, but it loses some of the tonality that the original image had. Does that make any sense at all? I'll try and give an example. Sometimes I would be editing certain images that I have underexposed, and while I can get a perfectly exposed image every time through editing, sometimes that's not what you want, because the original image had this kind of tone or quality to it with the underexposed shadow kind of tone to it. So it had a mood associated with the underexposed image that you're not going to get if you have a perfectly exposed image every time. And I think this mood is very important, especially when it comes to storytelling, or if you're putting stuff in a book or prints or whatever. That is something that I want to keep. So that's something I've been trying to do consciously lately, is that not to make every image perfectly exposed, but rather expose my image for the right amount of mood that I had when I felt when I took that image. Does that make sense? And that is something I've noticed that I had to be conscious about when shooting digital, because of how powerful software and dynamic range and stuff is. Moving on to the next point about film is grain. Grain is a pretty quintessential association when it comes to images. When you're thinking about film, if you're shooting film, you know film has this kind of organic grain to it. And I think Fujifilm's film simulations actually do a pretty good job of emulating it, because the in-camera tone curves and whatnot and the grain curves tend to be a little bit more randomized than if you're shooting plain digital, but it's not the same in my opinion. Film has this organic raw grain look to it, because the amount of grain you're going to be getting in an image comes with the ISO you shoot at and how you develop it, and then how you expose it during the frame as well. And everything is more randomized. So film has a more randomized grain structure, and you're going to get different amounts of grain depending on the lighting conditions you have as well. So certain amounts of shadow are going to have more grain and also bigger grain, and certain amounts of highlights are going to have, finer grain or even less grain than the shadowy parts. And this randomized structure kind of gives an organic feel to it that I don't personally think can be replicated in digital images. Fujifilm, like I said, does a pretty good job because they are able to randomize some certain grain structures, but software such as Lightroom or Capture One, funny thing is Capture One actually has a pretty powerful tool, because you can choose between different grain structures such as silver, fine, and classic and whatnot, but it doesn't appear to be, in my opinion, as randomized as Fujifilm's film simulations or even real film. And I think that's just something that you can't replicate very easily. You can kind of go through it, but if you're going through all that work and effort, then you might as well shoot real film, right? So that's just something I've noticed that is different between digital and film, and it's not something that I personally care too much about. I like having my digital images a little more cleaner, so I'll edit those to be a little bit more cleaner, and then my film images, naturally I want to look a little more grainier and more organic in that sense. So I just edit appropriate to the image that I get, and that's kind of a balance that I haven't been able to strike until very recently. It's something that I've noticed only by shooting film and delving into film, is that I prefer not to try and make my digital images look too much like film, even though it can, B, because it just creates more worry when it comes to thinking about editing every image like that. And this moves me into the next point that I kind of want to make, is that Fujifilm is never going to be able to replicate entirely, fully what I'm going to get from film, but film is never going to entirely replicate what I get from Fujifilm. Does that make sort of sense? They both have an appealing characteristic and quality to the colors and the images and the aesthetic that I get out of them, but I like them for different reasons and I don't expect them to look 100% like each other. If I try and edit every single one of my Fujifilm digital images to look like real film, I personally would just prefer to shoot film. And I know this only applies for certain things because some film stock is discontinued, so certain Fujifilm simulation recipes, you're going to be able to emulate old film stock that you just can't get your hands on. If you're shooting for that purpose, I understand, I get it. I've slowly been kind of trying to step into that world again as well, but I've just come to more peace of mind when it comes to understanding that they are different and I like them for different reasons. Fujifilm, I think, has done a great job of creating a certain look and association with certain film simulations that we like. And that's something we've learned from film in the past, is that certain film stock has a certain characteristic to it that we like. And so when you do that and you make a characteristic really good, like we've done in film simulations, you're able to get this nostalgic attachment to it with your community or your people, your photographers and shooters that otherwise would not have been associated with your cameras. And so I think Fujifilm does a really good job at this. So for example, Classic Chrome, I know I'm going to be able to get a flatter image that has cooler tones and a little more tealer blues and whatnot. And with Classic Negative, I know I'm going to get brighter highlights, higher contrast, a little darker shadows than if I was shooting in Classic Chrome. And I can go through these different film simulations and shoot and get what I want to look. But if I expect my Classic Chrome to look like Portrait 160 or even a film simulation to look like Portrait 160, then I become fixated on needing my images to look like film. And that's just a bit of a hassle and a bit of struggle that I don't want to get into. When it comes to shooting, I want to shoot a little more freer and just not worry so much about the finer technical things about photography, focus a little bit more on what I'm trying to express and what I'm trying to show through the pictures themselves. And that's, again, something that I hadn't come to terms with for a very long time, but something I'm slowly coming to terms with now and something I'm enjoying about the cameras. I can shoot both digital Fujifilm and real film and be happy doing so. I can expect certain different things from the different stuff, but I don't have to be so fixated on making my digital images look like real film, you know what I mean? So like I said, not a scientific comparison, a little bit of the psychology that I've been dealing with behind the shooting experience. I want to know your guys' thoughts because I know everyone has different thoughts. Some people prefer to shoot pure JPEG film simulations and they can kind of tweak the settings to get a really, really good emulation of something that looks just like film. Other people prefer to shoot just film and not have to worry with all the digital technicalities of it. What are your thoughts? How do you manage both mediums if you shoot both mediums? And what kind of words of advice can you offer to other people who are struggling between thinking about the psychology of those two things? And does it even matter? Because probably it doesn't, I guess, right? But anyways, hopefully, man, this video was another mess of things. I feel like I was all over the place again. But hopefully there was some sort of cohesiveness or structure to this video that made enough sense. Please let me know what you guys think of the video. If you liked it, please like it down below. Subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in the prints, I'm selling them as a set together on my website. They are going to be limited run, but I hand print everything myself and I check everything myself. But there's not going to be too many of these. So if you're interested, you can pick one up in the store down below. And yeah, but otherwise, thanks as always, you guys, for watching. I will see you guys in another video, hopefully. I'm just still recovering from the flu I had about a week and a half ago, but I'm thankfully now feeling a lot better. So thank you guys for all the get well wishes and whatnot that you guys left, and I'll see you guys in another video. Peace.